Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. How are you doing? Okay, let's start the second day with Victoria Jones. Give a warm applause, please. Thank you very much.
Right, good morning everyone, you risers. Thank you for coming to say hello this morning. I really appreciate your attention. So today I'm going to be talking about Bitcoin and war. I thought, we could do with something a little bit more exciting, and the subtitle is Approaching the Endgame. So wars have always been about money, and the recent skirmishes we've witnessed with Russia and the Middle East are no different. In focusing as justification for these wars, the mainstream media narrative focuses on the moral decrepitude of these other countries as they attempt to build their own nuclear weapons, even though the West is abundant in them. There is more to this story, and in talking you through the history of money today, I want to maybe perhaps uncover what some of the more esoteric reasons for this might be, and illustrate where Bitcoin fits in with this. We are at a pivotal moment in history, and if we are to strive for the best possible outcomes, we need to appreciate just how important those outcomes will be, and make sure that we're focusing on the best ones. So in order to focus on this talk today, I'm going to liken humanity to a honeybee. For the average human being, they're really focused on making sure that their family is safe and well, they've got a good job, they've got enough of an income, and they're putting some money aside in case there's ever a rainy day. But unfortunately, what often tends to happen, the poor honeybee doesn't realise that it's part of a hive. And from time to time, the beekeeper's going to come along and steal part of its money. And of course, whenever this happens, the honeybee has no idea what's actually going on. The poor thing is left devastated, and it's got to start all over again. And isn't that just the perfect analogy for our financial system right now? So how did we end up in this position? Well, as Bitcoiners, we know that gold was money for over 3,000 years, but of course the problem with gold is it's a physical asset, so it's prone to being stolen. And so I've got a couple of examples of this from history on board, one of which is William the Conqueror, who invaded England, and then of course the first thing he did was take inventory of all the assets he'd just conquered by compiling the Doomsday Book and going around Britain and figuring out what they had. And the other example is Henry VIII, who obtained a great deal of wealth through the dissolution of the monasteries. When Henry VIII first came to power, there were only 12 royal palaces as part of the royal family, but by the time he died, there were 60, which just goes to show the degree to which he expanded his wealth, and a big part of that came from robbing the treasures of these monasteries. So, gold has traditionally been seen as the money of kings, silver is said to be the money of gentlemen, and paper is the money of slaves. And of course, at the moment, we're all transacting in paper money, but how did we end up in this situation? So if I take you back to Henry VIII in the 1500s, I would say this was really the point at which it all changed. At the time, most of the world was under the subjugation of their religious leaders. Most kings answered to the popes, and of course, they held strict moral codes, and one of the strictest laws was the usury laws. It was banned to charge interest on money that you loaned, and of course, this could be something that would damn your eternal soul, so most people avoided it because they didn't want to go to hell. But of course, Henry VIII, having dissolved the monasteries and also beheaded 2 of his wives, clearly there was no hope for his eternal soul, so why not push back on these usury laws? And so he was actually one of the first people to repeal them, and this was where things really started to change. Once you are able to charge interest on money, you create the possibility of being able to collaborate and form businesses, because there's a possibility of having profit. Until you can actually invest and get a reward, there's not a lot of point in doing that. And so this is where the joint stock companies first came into being. And in fact, the first joint stock company was established by his daughter, Mary I, who established the Muscovy Company that traded with Russia until 1917, which is slightly ironic because of course one of the first things Mary wanted to do was execute all the Protestants so that he'd go back to being a Catholic country, but clearly the usury laws were not part of her agenda. One of the most successful joint stock trading companies that was built in this period was the East India Company, which was established by Elizabeth I. And really, this was the secret behind the golden age of Britain. The fact that these merchants could collaborate together on these big trading companies in order to trade all over the world really started to explode the wealth of the Western nations. But unfortunately, Elizabeth died without any children, so the throne had to go to one of her nephews, which was one of the Catholic kings. And so for the next 100 years, Britain was thrown into turmoil. There was civil war, they tried executing one of their monarchs, they experimented with being a republic, there was a great plague and a great fire. England really was not the best place to be in the 1600s. However, there was another country nearby who took the idea and ran with it. The East India Company ended up becoming so large and successful, it eventually had an army that was bigger than that of the British government. However, the Dutch East India Trading Company ended up being 4 times larger than the English East India Company at one point, which just goes to show how successful they were, and really this was the source of the Dutch Empire. Now, of course, once all of these merchants start collaborating, this really opens the door for financial investment, financial assets. This really was where the paper financial currency that we use today really came into being. And of course, in order to manage all of this, it really relies on regulation and governments. In order to collect the profits and then distribute the profits, there was also a need for a central bank, and so this is where the first central bank became established, the Bank of Amsterdam, or the Wisselbank, which was established in 1604, and it was phenomenally successful. We also get the tulip bubble, which I talked about a bit more last year. So this was the first example of legislation interfering in all of this paper, which contributed to the explosion of the tulip bubble and then its collapse a few years later. So anyway, as I mentioned earlier, England was going through its dramas, but finally, 100 years later, they got their act together, and they decided that the solution to the problem was to banish all of the Scottish kings, the Stuart kings, and instead they were going to establish their own Protestant king so they could finally do what they wanted. And so this was how William of Orange was introduced to the UK in what they termed the Glorious Revolution, although many will debate whether it was all that glorious, because part of what came with William of Orange was the establishment of the Bank of England. Now, even though the Bank of Amsterdam had been incredibly successful, one of its weak points was that it was a fully capitalised bank. Which meant that if one of their investors went bust and everyone found out about it, there was suddenly a run on the bank. Everyone wanted their money back because they felt that it was about to go bust. And so one of the things the Bank of England did in order to avoid that was it introduced a fractional reserve, which allowed them to lend up to 10% based on 1% of their assets. And so they thought it was a great idea. And if you've ever wondered why the world really seemed to explode from the 1700s, this was probably why. The British government effectively wrote themselves a blank cheque. To such an extent, even banks were set up in these days as joint stock companies. So in order to set up the Bank of England, they needed investors, and they were able to raise 1.2 million as an initial investment. But due to the amount of money that was spent by William of Orange fighting his wars in France, that debt exploded within 4 years from 1.2 million to 16 million. It was absolutely horrendous. Not only that, by 1711, someone did an audit on the British government and they discovered that 9 million had been spent, and this was completely unaccounted for. Now, part of the paperwork of the Bank of England had established that any interest on the debt accrued by the Bank of England would be paid by the British public, but at that stage they hadn't actually figured out how they were going to do that. And so the guy who proposed the paperwork for the Bank of England came up with another solution. He said, well, there are people doing so well with trading, why don't we set up a trading company, and the profits from that company can then pay off the debt from the Bank of England. And so this is where the South Sea Company came from. And so they thought, yeah, that's a great idea. They went ahead with that plan. However, at the same time, William Paterson had a colleague called John Law. They were both Scotsmen, and John Law was watching with fascination as Britain was implementing this plan. He was also a bit of an outlaw. He was wanted for murder after he'd been involved in a duel and it had gone wrong. So he hightailed it over to France, closed it up with the Duke of Orleans and said, hey, do you know what they're doing in Britain? They've got this great idea, they've got this fractional reserve bank, and then they're paying off the debt with this trading company. Why don't you think we should do the same thing? And so they thought that was a great idea, and they kind of 10x'd the mission over in France, and naturally it ended in disaster. In fact, it was so disastrous, it really defined the future of these two countries. Unfortunately, because of the way in which John Law had gone about it, when the whole thing collapsed, there really were no other options. He disappeared to Italy, and the leaders of France were left to figure out a solution. So what they had to do, or what they decided to do, was revalue all the property of France, issue paper notes against that currency, and they were going to manage their currency that way. It ended up being a complete disaster. The people in the cities who understood what was going on were able to take advantage of the situation and did quite nicely. But the peasants in the countryside who had no idea about these sophisticated new financial instruments had no idea. They were absolutely devastated, and of course this is what directly contributed to the French Revolution. Over in Britain, however, they managed the situation rather differently. Because they'd managed to keep the South Sea Company separate from the Bank of England, the first Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, basically confiscated the assets of the directors of the South Sea Company, distributed the profits to some of the victims who had been worst affected, and smoothed things over politically with those who were seen to have benefited through the government and also the king and the king's mistresses, who'd all been given sweet deals on the South Sea Company, and that was seen as very corrupt at the time. But he smoothed all of that over. And so, and in doing that, he kind of set the precedent for the next few centuries as to how they were going to handle this situation. Because ultimately, any debt, the debt that was accrued by the South Sea Company was eventually split between the Bank of England and the East India Company. And in fact, that debt was kept on the books of the Bank of England for almost 300 years. It was not actually fully paid off until 2015, when it was paid off by the Prime Minister, George Osborne. So it was a debt that was acquired by Britain that we were paying the interest on for over 300 years. But this really was, it was such a successful solution to the problem, it's one that's been repeated over and over. And so this really set the trajectory for both of these companies. Britain ended up with a very stable company because they'd been able to maintain the reputation of the Bank of England, whereas France became an utter basket case. And so, by the end of the century, obviously the French Revolution led to the rise of Napoleon. Now, considering that their currency had been devastated, one of the things that Napoleon did that really inspired loyalty with his soldiers was that he insisted on paying them in gold coins. And this was part of what made Napoleon very successful. At the same time, Britain was watching with great interest, and by this stage they were starting to realise the degree to which messing with the currency of the country can really disrupt things. And so, as the American Revolution played out, one of the things they did was they printed fake continentals, which really disrupted the economy and the supply lines of the southern states, which again had an indirect huge impact on the North winning the American Revolution rather than the South. However, Napoleon's reputation was pretty solid and he was doing very well, and this meant that Britain was now going to be facing a problem of their own. How were they going to succeed in overcoming Napoleon? And so one of the things they discussed in Parliament was, maybe they should start to ease up on their currency. And of course, there were people at the time who still, knew of their grandparents who'd been around at the time of the South Sea Bubble, so people were horrified by this. And this is a political cartoon that was drawn up at the time of the Prime Minister William Pitt assaulting the old lady of Threadneedle Street, wanting to steal all her assets. And this is where the nickname, the old lady of Threadneedle Street, was obtained by the Bank of England. William Pitt eventually won the political argument. This was also the point at which income tax was introduced, because they persuaded the population that it was their moral duty to pay income tax in order to win the wars of Napoleon. And by doing all of this, they were very successful, and they were able to succeed in defeating Napoleon in the Battle of Waterloo. Now, if we look at the finances for a second, in 1797, when they were talking about expanding the currency supply, at the time, the Bank of England had 5.3 billion in the bank, but there were 10.8 million currency notes in circulation, which meant they had a deficit of 5.5 million. So they were already in deficit. It was going to be a big risk to expand the money supply. But because their gamble paid off, they actually won an indemnity of 14 million, almost 3 times as much as the bullion that the Bank of England had in the bank at the time. And so this enabled the Bank of England to restore their coffers. And clearly many bankers at the time breathed a huge sigh of relief, and that was the point at which they decided they needed to rectify the currency and withdraw the excess currency notes from circulation. But they way overdid it. They reduced the notes in circulation by 80% down to 2.2 million, which ended up giving them a surplus of 8.9 million in the Bank of England. And of course, this created a huge financial panic. In fact, it's the most famous and the first big banking crisis, which occurred in 1825. So Britain now had a problem. They'd escaped with through the skin of their teeth in attempting to manipulate the money supply. They've managed to get things back on track, but they've now created a problem in the economy. You know, the first industrial revolution had just been gaining its feet, but you know, this banking crisis really brought it to a screeching end because you know, without any currency circulating in the economy, it's really difficult for businesses to survive and be successful. And so they needed a new plan. And so what they did, you know, after the South Sea Bubble, they'd introduced a Bubble Act in 1720, which banned the formation of joint stock companies unless you had permission from the monarch. But in order to stimulate the economy, what they did in 1825 was they repealed that. And so if you consider that the 1600s were really the century of trade, the 1700s were the century of revolution, the 1800s became the century of financial panics. And there were many financial panics, but there are two main ones that I've got on the board here. You know, in 1844, the British government expanded access to the joint stock companies because it was working so well, but this was followed 3 years later by the railway mania crisis. And then in 1856, they introduced the idea of limited liability, which they secured for joint stock companies, which meant that, you know, businesses could invest, but if they were unsuccessful, the directors wouldn't become liable. You know, basically a business could fail and the directors could carry on without their lives being destroyed. And of course, just 1 year later, this led to the Panic of 1857. And of course, Saifedean Ammous, in his book, The Bitcoin Standard, he talks about this period as being the Belle Epoque, as an era of great prosperity. And he puts that down to this being because our currency and the currency of Europe was on the gold standard. But actually, there's more to the story. You know, there was a lot going on behind the scenes in order to manage the legislation of Britain. And in many ways, they led the way in this legislation. And that is actually the reason why Britain led the way with the Industrial Revolution. They created such a friendly environment for these businesses. They were able to take off like a rocket, and most of Europe lagged behind. But of course, as Britain was going through its financial panics, America was going through the same thing, and they regularly had runs on banks as they would fail. And so they needed a solution for this. Obviously, you know, if a bank failed, individual people, their lives were devastated. And so this is where they came up with the idea for the Federal Reserve. And the idea was that, you know, if one of the banks went under, the rest of the banks would provide a buffer, and that would keep things going smoothly. But of course, this is an illusion. The fact that a bank would occasionally go bankrupt is what kept the monetary system honest, you know, by creating a system whereby no one was held accountable. You just open the gates for, you know, unlimited money supply, and of course it's the people who own the banks who decide where that money goes. And of course this played out in 1914 with the beginning of the First World War. Now, of course, when war broke out in Europe in World War I, there were people who had grandparents who remembered the Napoleonic Wars, and by this point, the elites of Europe had figured out how it was that Britain had managed to win the Napoleonic Wars. So the moment the First World War broke out, the first thing all of these countries did was abandon their gold standard. And so this, of course, is why World War I was so devastating. It was the first time in history where a war had been fought, where a blank cheque was written in order to pay the bills for this war. But not only did that make the First World War so large and so devastating, it also meant that by the time the war was over, the currencies of Europe, their currencies were devastated, and this gave them a real problem. How were they going to fix it? Obviously, with the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the indemnity is what enabled Britain to recover their currency and really, you know, laid the foundation for the British Empire, and Britain kind of taking its role as the leader of the world's reserve currency. But of course, when the World War I was over and the bill was landed on Germany, there was no possible way in which they could pay this. And so what that meant was it wasn't possible to restore the currencies, and they were left with a problem and that they didn't know how to deal with. And so in the interwar years between World War I and World War II, you know, this was a big political debate. How were they going to repair their currencies? There was a convention in Geneva in 1922 where the countries got together and they came up with this agreement that they were going to exchange each other's currency and keep that in their treasury for them. And this laid the foundation for the gold exchange standard, which was introduced by William Churchill, who was actually Chancellor before he became Prime Minister before World War II in 1936. And this exchange standard gold exchange standard is not talked about very often, but actually it was hugely impactful. What he did with this gold exchange standard was he set the price of gold at a rate similar to what it was before the First World War. He insisted that only countries could exchange gold bullion with each other, and he banned the use of gold as currency in circulation. By 1925 it was still possible to go to the bank, hand in a banknote and receive gold in exchange, but with this act he obliterated that. And so anyway, as this started to kick in, a number of European banks started to fail because the currency just wasn't ready for that. That led to the stock market crisis of 1929, which then led to the Great Depression. And in spite of the fact that the Federal Reserve was set up as an insurance policy for all of these bank failures, it turned out that it wasn't going to protect anyone at all, because there were a series of bank failures around America that led to the Great Depression. And so this, of course, was the point at which America decided that they were going to confiscate the use of gold in circulation as well. And this had huge impacts, which I'm going to talk about later. So anyway, after the Great Depression, that led to World War II. The gold exchange standard introduced by Britain was such a failure, but they decided to mimic the idea, but just make America responsible for it, because they now had all the gold, as they had managed to stay out of the war until the very last minute. And so this took place with the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. But as part of that, by this point, people were getting pretty fed up. They'd experienced all this war, all this devastation, and some politicians were starting to ask some astute questions. How come we can create all this money for war, but what about all the poor people who've been suffering? And so this was where the idea of the welfare state really came into being. Hey, if we can take over the central bank, maybe we can use some of that funding to create welfare programs for our population. And so certainly this was when the Bank of England was nationalised, and actually a series of bank nationalisations carried on across the world. This started a trend, and by the end of the 1900s we've got the European Central Bank. It's not just central banks that have been nationalised, but you've got regional banks that are now coalescing, because of course the more banks are in a network with each other, they provide a buffer when things go wrong. But of course this has consequences. It looks like everything's safe and stable on the surface, but of course behind the scenes the problems are just being swept under the rug. And you can see this chart of US debt that started to climb in about 1940, then in 1971, when Nixon took America off the gold standard, it really started to skyrocket, because of course, when there are no checks and balances in the economy, the debt can take off. And of course, the governments will tell us that everything's fine as long as you let us control things, not because things are actually okay, it just means that they can disguise the problem much better if they allow for the debt. And of course, this is a problem that's occurring right around the world. Just in the last 10 years, global debt has exploded by 100 billion. And so most of us here are very familiar with this problem. We're just waiting for the mathematical inevitability of this to play out and for everything to fail, and we assume that Bitcoin is going to take over. But will it? Because the banks have been doing this for a long time, and they've got a very slick strategy. And clearly their plan is, whenever anyone is suffering, we just need to find someone else to step in and smooth over the problem while we manage the debt in the background, and everything will be okay. And so it's not just about central banks anymore. The central banks have a central bank, which is the Bank for International Settlements. And this was the bank that was initially set up to manage the indemnity payments that were due from Germany after the First World War. But gradually, over time, it's taken on this role as being the arbiter. When central banks are struggling, they will step in and solve the problem. And to this date, we have 63 central banks that are now part of this system, and of course is responsible for managing the SWIFT system of international payments. However, there are a few notable holdouts. Can you guess who they are? We have some rebels who have either been excluded or don't want any part of it, and they include Iran, oh surprise, surprise, Syria, Russia, North Korea, and Venezuela. There are also some smaller banks, but these are the main ones. And what does the Bank of International Settlements say is a problem with this? Well, the problem with these rebellious banks is that they fuel shadow finance and parallel systems. They make global financial stability harder to manage. They challenge the Bank of International Settlements' role as the hub of a unified international financial system. So basically what they're saying, as long as we're in control, everything will be okay, and you rebels are just causing problems for everybody. But actually, it's not easy to be a rebel. It has huge implications to not be part of this system. And the countries who are not part of the system are struggling because it makes coordinating international payments slow, unreliable and expensive, trade grinds to a halt, foreign reserves and sovereign payments are blocked, currencies are devalued and there's dangers with inflation, there's loss of investor and business confidence, and growth slows or reverses. So given that this is the situation, this fiat currency system that we've been left with, what does it actually buy us? And of course, the people who are maintaining that we need to stay in control of this system, they will maintain that it gives us healthcare. Certainly in the UK, healthcare is almost a religion. If any politician goes after the NHS, there is literally hell to pay and they're not going to be elected again. The fact that people have got pensions when they retire might not be much of a pension, but it's still a pension. So access to social security, obviously, there are some people who aren't able to operate in the system as it is, and of course they fall outside the bounds of that and they need some help and support. Travel and immigration, obviously travel has really exploded through the fiat system, but we've also got a lot of immigration as well. And in summary, essentially there's more of everything, everything's quicker and everything's cheaper, which some people would say is a great thing. But of course, if we contrast that with the reality, certainly in England, you've got a number of crumbling hospitals that aren't being maintained. Obviously, the closer you are to the origins of the fiat system, that's when you get the most value out of it. And over time, as the currency loses value, the hospitals start to deteriorate, healthcare becomes rationed, care is often compromised. The same with pensions. Even private pensions are vulnerable to financial shocks. In 2022, when Liz Truss wanted to introduce a form of free market economics in Britain, the financial system almost went into meltdown to such an extent that she was sacked as Prime Minister. She was seen as completely irresponsible for suggesting it in the first place. Social security, recently in the UK, they've tried to introduce a bill that will severely curtail welfare spending in order to support the finances of Britain. But of course, for the average person who can't work within the original system, they rely on these social security payments to manage their lives. And so if the government comes in and randomly changes the goalposts, this creates a real problem for them. And of course, a number of caring MPs are rightly concerned about that. Travel and immigration, a lot of people don't actually recognise that travel and also immigration supports the GDP of a country, and the GDP of a country is very important because that's how countries are valued these days. But unfortunately, while that may suit the politicians, it also strains local public services, which of course is causing a lot of local outrage. And in contrast to everything being more quicker and cheaper, what we're really ending up with is more low quality, more pollution, and more poverty. Poverty is an interesting one because there's a lot of gaslighting around this subject. This chart was produced by the Centre for Global Development in 2014, along with an article, praising the fact that over time they were managing to put a limit on poverty rates. And what this chart demonstrates is that poverty rates reduced significantly in the 1800s, and then of course they flattened off in the 1900s. But what they're not telling you here, of course, is that this data has been compiled with the US dollar. And of course, if you contrast that with a chart of the price of gold in US dollars, you can see that while the price of gold was stable, that's when we had the greatest reduction in poverty rates. But even though the chart is saying that poverty rates are stable in the US dollar, if you contrast with that with the price of gold in the US dollar, poverty rates are actually skyrocketing. The reality of the situation could not be more different, but of course this is the way in which data and statistics is used to gaslight us. It was ever thus. So, if I take you back to the first economist, Adam Smith, who wrote the book Wealth of Nations, 1776, at the time, of course, he was observing the horrors going on in France with the devaluation of their currency as they experimented with paper assignats and the contrast with Britain, who'd managed to keep their currency stable. And what he pointed out, that it was not by gold or silver, but by labour that all the wealth of the world was originally purchased. So by messing with our money, these elites who run the central banking system, trying to convince us that it's for our own benefit, are actually stealing our wealth from us as all of this debt collects behind the scenes. And so what that means, are we approaching the end game? A lot of us as Bitcoiners assume that, Bitcoin is a mathematical inevitability, but is it really? If the bankers manage to achieve their goal of getting all central banks under their domain, at the moment they're heavily regulating the exchanges, they are closing a number of the open doorways. You've also got prominent people advocating for Bitcoin as a form of digital gold rather than a currency. But as I pointed out earlier, it was really when gold was removed as a form of currency from the local population that debt really started to skyrocket, because the tangible evidence the local population has as to how their money is changing has been removed, and so it's possible to portray this grand illusion. Recently I was just talking to Jed, the US recently bombed Iran on the 21st of June, and lo and behold, just 3 days earlier, Syria first made its first transaction via the SWIFT system. They finally got Syria to capitulate. Russia used to be part of the system of Bank of International Settlements, but was expelled when they bombed Ukraine. Of course, we're constantly hearing about Rocket Man in North Korea, and Venezuela is devastated regularly by problems with inflation. Is the truth of the situation that actually these people are pushing back against the Western financial system? We understand what the problem is as Bitcoiners. We think Bitcoin is the solution, but these other countries definitely understand how they are vulnerable. In fact, there's been a huge rise in Islamic banking, who rely on Sharia law in order to ban things like usury payments, going back to the problem that first initiated this when Henry VIII rebelled against the usury laws. The problem with Sharia law, though, is that they still allow profit on investment, which really, unfortunately, is interest by another name. It doesn't really solve the problem. Obviously, we understand that Bitcoin is a more robust solution, but who will win the battle? What will it actually be? Because again, going back to Adam Smith, he points out that money is a key in the cog of the great wheel of circulation, and the moment that is disrupted, everything else is affected as well. So that's all I have to share with you for today. Those of you who haven't heard of me before, which is probably 1% of you by now, this is my book, Truth Decay, How Bitcoin Fixes This. I also provide a number of newsletters on my website, and it's possible to sign up for that. But recently I've introduced a starter guide, because obviously with this happening, it's important that we educate the world. I know many people are working on this, but for complete beginners, to help them understand what's happening with Bitcoin. But also, we actually need to work on the infrastructure. So I've been working with Darren, also known as the Crypto Donkey, and we've been putting together a series of courses to try and educate people, encourage people to start owning their own nodes, know what cold wallets are. We've got a series of them that's going to take time to work on, but we've all got to start from somewhere. So, this is just a quick slideshow of some of the things that we're working on. Some are complete, some not so much. So those can be found at my website, satoshispage.com/products. Thank you very much.